Good morning everyone. So today I'm gonna tell you a little bit about buttons, but it's not gonna be like a huge tutorial. Instead I want to focus on just 5 things, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things to make your buttons just be better. So buttons are really important, and getting them right is one of the most essential things in any interface. Buttons are usually the thing that you click or tap on to get to the final page or the final success. So in a case of an e-commerce, or as some other people say, an internet store, you need to push a couple of buttons to get to the checkout and actually get your goods, and then somebody gets paid. So first of all, let's ask ourselves the fundamental question: what is a button? A button is an interactive element with a clearly labeled action, which basically in most cases it means that it's a rectangle that says pay. So if you see a rectangle that says pay on it, it's really likely that when you click or tap on it, you're gonna get to your credit card details screen. Okay, so the anatomy of a button is pretty simple. It can have a fill, a border, a shadow, and it has some other characteristics as well. And first of all, it really needs to have a label, because buttons without labels, like if they only have an icon, are way more difficult to understand by many users. So keep that in mind. And all the buttons should have a minimal inner margin, which is called padding, which is also a safe area inside the button for the label to actually have some breathing room and to be readable. And it has an outer margin that's, well, just called margin. And of course they can be filled with a color, a gradient, and an image, but don't do images, please. And the corners can be rounded, very rounded, or not rounded at all. So before I begin my 5 main tips, here's a micro tip for you. So if you want the button to have a little bit more strength in the messaging, add a right-facing chevron next to the label on it. Kind of like this. And this button is actually gonna perform a little bit better than a button with just the text. Okay, now that you know the basics, let's begin with our button manifesto. So the first rule of buttons is you don't talk about buttons. The first rule of buttons is that they should look like a button, which basically means that it should look like something that we're completely used to. And most buttons are rectangular shapes, like buttons on your TV remote. Some are circles, so if you're having a shape that's neither a rectangle nor a circle, it's gonna be really confusing to the users. And in a way, this is also how skeuomorphism is still in our digital interfaces, because even though our buttons are completely flat, we're still using the metaphor from our TV remote. So having an organic blobby shape, like, just a blob for a button, is gonna be really confusing because many people will think it's decoration. And the same with triangles, they're not really typical button shape. And the other way to actually show that something is active and that you can act upon it is to just have an underlined link, because Google habituated us into thinking that underlined links are really like the same as buttons. And obviously links were there on the web before the buttons even, but right now that connection is even stronger. So I think that if you were to pick the best button shapes, it would be rectangle, link, and then the circle. Okay, so now when we know the button has to look like a button, let's talk about the size. So let's start with big buttons. So if the button is too big, it can be confused with a banner or an advertisement. And there's actually something called banner blindness, which means that we are instinctively skipping over things that are the size of a typical advertisement. So if your call to action button is the size of a banner, it might actually be completely skipped. But on the other hand, having the buttons too small is also bad, because especially on mobile devices, they're not gonna be as easy to touch on. So buttons needs to be large enough to be comfortable. And for mobile devices, it means 44 by 44 points minimum. And for Android mobile devices, it's 48 by 48. Obviously, you can go a little bit above that, so 50 and 60 are still good numbers. And the buttons should be rectangular, so the height could be 50 or 60, but the width can be anything to just fit the label. And when designing for desktop, for computers, obviously you have the mouse cursor, so the buttons could be a little smaller, but keep in mind that when you're moving the cursor around the screen, you still need to aim to actually click on the button. So the bigger it is, it's gonna be more likely to get there quicker, and it's gonna be much easier to click on it, right? So that's a lot better for the user. Okay, number 3, alignment is everything. So there's this big problem in UI design, like probably 80% of buttons have their labels not vertically centered on the button. Sometimes they're not even horizontally centered, but that's like really bad. And our brains don't really like to process something that's chaotic like this. So the more the button is misaligned and the more the label is badly aligned within the button, the longer it takes for our brains to process it. So we're kind of not liking the button. We're kind of hating the entire interface because of that, just a tiny bit. So you shouldn't really do that. The alignment of everything is pretty tricky, especially with the bounding boxes everywhere, because they usually stick a little bit more to one side of the font than to the other. And when you're trying to align things to the bounding boxes, you end up with the font being, well, not in the center. Okay, so here's my trick for this. The best way to align the fonts is to align to the cap height, which basically is the height of the capital letter, which means that you'll be completely skipping the descenders and from the bottom aligning to the baseline of the font, not the descenders of like the lowercase j or y. Okay, number 4, shadows. You need to really work on your shadows because most of the default shadows in the design tools are horrible. And first of all, a button with a shadow is more likely to be perceived as a button, so that makes it actually faster to access and faster to understand. So yeah, buttons should have shadows. Like, even as much as we really love flat design and we love the simplicity of it and the classiness, shadows are really good to actually make the button look like a button. But shadows can also make the button look like an eyesore, and here's an example of that. If the shadow is too thick and too strong and too dark, it's actually gonna make the button stand out way too much and be annoying visually. So the good rule is to actually use a hint of the main color from the button in the shadow, so it kind of reflects a little bit light of it and creates the illusion to be looking a little bit more natural. And the last, 5th rule is readable labels. So we already established that the label needs to be centered in the button, but also there is a lot of problems out there with buttons being so small that the label is practically squished inside them. It kind of makes our brain scan a little bit more to understand where the text begins. So I came up with a rule called the W rule, and it means that you can use the capital letter W of that same font that you have in the label and use one W, rotate it on the top and the bottom, and use the double W. Well, that's a very nice sounding word, a double W, but you can use the double W on the sides, and it's gonna have enough breathing room for the button to just look good. And of course, buttons on mobile devices can be even longer than that, but keep the double W on the sides a minimum size of the button. Okay, so these are the rules that I use to make the buttons click. Yeah, see the joke? Right. And I think that if you use those rules, you're gonna make a lot better buttons, and in the end, there's gonna be a much bigger success rate for the product, because basically the buttons are what it's all about. Like, we need to click on something for somebody to get their money. And while we're there, there's one more button that I'd like you to click today, and that's the subscribe button. Just click on it and everybody will be happy. So thanks for watching. Cheers.